Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified video edition. If you happen to be watching this somewhere on YouTube or whatnot, I'm your host, Mark the Liberty, and joining me today is
Corey, the reasonable person, not Griner. At least I hope I'm a reasonable person. Maybe I'll pass that rule. We'll find out.
To mark this special occasion of this video podcast, we actually have a guest on as well too. We'll be joined by Matt Lee, Senior Director of Security and Compliance at Pax8, to discuss reasonable person rules and a whole lot else in the space of MSPs and MSSPs. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and roll on in. So today we are excited to have a chat here with Matt Lee, Senior Director of Security and Compliance at Pax8. Welcome to the show, Matt. It's great to have you on here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm super excited. You know, I love WatchGuard and followed Corey for, I don't know, since the beginning of time, I think, potentially. So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Mark calls me basically Pop Corey. So to him, beginning of time is apt. But man, it's a pleasure to have you on. We've chatted before and you do a lot of great things.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, so we want to just get started first with anytime we have someone on, you know, we like to hear what we call your hacker origin story. Basically, you know, every superhero's got one. And on the security side, like, in other words, what really got you started in information security?
Yeah, it's actually quite succinct, or well, not succinct. I'm never accused of that, but it's actually, you know, for me, very profound, right? So I was with an MSP for about 11 years. We ultimately sold and exited from an MSP that was over 35 million or so in revenue at the time of exit. And so I had been working from dealing with security events, dealing with incidents, dealing with this rise in understanding of how to handle, you know, kind of security events, and really just kind of proving my own ignorance to what that really took to manage. And as we grew and became a larger MSP, I was tapped as the head of security of this new 20 or so million dollar entity and the head of technology and security. And so I wrote out this email on a Wednesday and I said, hey, my single greatest fear is that we're the next MSP to be compromised in such attacks as the Kaseya event and other things at that time back in 2019 or so. And so I had always been involved in the cyber incidents. But when I made that transition was that Friday after sending out that email, we had bought another company and that company was compromised. And that compromise did cost us more than 2 commas. And it did take 18 months of my life. And it changed me through the traumatic stress and the, you know, loss and just the abject anger and hatred and pain and all the things that happened all the way through the companies we supported, but also our internal space. And we lost a lot of those companies and we lost a lot of those humans through that endeavor. And so for me, it was just one of those things where I finally picked up the sword at that time, if that makes sense, right? It now became something for me that was table stakes, right? It was what my mission was. And it was even driven further by taking that and extrapolating it forward in my head and saying, if we don't change this, like we're a soft target, we have very virgin software and technology and tons of tech debt and tons of failure of knowledge and ignorance by choice or otherwise. And so if my children and your children and their children are to have the same virgin experience and beauty of technology and how it improves our day-to-day lives, we're gonna have to make a difference. We're gonna have to change. So for me, it was about pursuing where I can make the largest impact in helping people understand the challenges we face. And so I took on a mission that day.
That is so awesome, by the way. I love that. And one thing a follow-up question, just because it's such a cool origin story I want to ask you is, like, that's really what we don't want people to have to do. Like, we don't want people to get burned by the fire.
Yeah.
But as a longtime security guy, I think we all know that security is not number one to business. All right. We're in business to do whatever our business is.
Sure.
Technology, and it always feels like a cost. And we know that as security experts, but what we're trying to avoid is exactly what you said. So how can we tell someone that hasn't had that experience? How can we convince them without them literally, you know, sometimes you say, just let the kids safely touch the fire and that's when they'll learn. Right. I just want to avoid that, or at least make the pain of it. So any ideas there on how you can
I use analogies, right? Because I understand that what I like to follow, and you'll know that I'm not known for succinct answers, but like what I always understand is that there's this huge gap of understanding before someone can take something that's not so available to understand. Like the stove, you touch the stove once, it's hot, it really sucks, you don't touch the stove again, right? As a kid, there's this like very small entry level dose to understand the real problem. But in the same breath, as you look forward, like as you look forward over to like a building burning. Let's say you're looking in 1860 or so, and you have a 14-story building, tall for its day, burning, and there's no fire escape. There is no such thing. And you have a human standing in that window and saying, hey, I can either jump to my death or burn to my death. And you know that's the only options for that human. That's what's going to happen. There's a very like guttural understanding of that. And it's very easy to say we need fire escapes, right? Because you have this contextual understanding. Well, when you're starting to say that about like, people talking about cyber, you don't have this direct correlation to, hey, there's going to be ransomware and it's going to be a problem. They're going to egress data. You're going to have all these regulatory challenges. You're going to have these image challenges. You're going to have people hating to work there. You're going to have these challenges. And it's really hard to like make someone understand that. So for me, I try to use the analogy of everybody understands when I talk about that dude standing in front of the fire, they know what's happening. Yep. They can image that and they can tie it to cyber. So I like to use analogies to bring it down. And I think what we're overcoming is in no other industry with this level of professionalism, do you have such a distrust, right? If you look at doctors, like my doctor doesn't have to explain the pressures on walls of vessels at the long ends of the smaller pieces, how that changes with higher pressure and how it might damage the skin. So doesn't have to go into that. He goes, hey, you have blood pressure. It's a problem. Take this pill. And you go, okay, cool. And so we're in that phase where we're having to educate through that. And we're having to actually prove we know this. And there's a lot of things that go into that. But ultimately, because I'm, short answers, ultimately, I would say it comes down to just trying to educate in every way you can. And then at the same time, hold the vendors more accountable, hold the people that are actually making those decisions more accountable. So,
yeah, 100%. So before we dive into the main topics, I wanted to say, like, so most of our listeners are resellers or managed service providers, a few of them even MSSPs. Yeah. So they're probably already familiar with Pax8, but you want to just give us a little bit about Pax8 and what you do there?
Yeah, so it's really cool. I actually proposed this mission. Pax8's a distributor. We bring vendors on our line card. So, everybody understands that part of it. We also see ourselves as educators. We're really trying to build and grow that capability of the MSP as more demand is happening for that. So we have that as a mission. But ultimately, my job, most fun in the world, is to really try to drive some of that security thought leadership, to try to educate, to one-to-one educate, right? Corey, you've carried that torch for such a long time, but to also go and speak on behalf of those organizations that are trying to solve this with their constituency and help them make those same analogies, right? Back to Corey's question of how do you do that? Sometimes it's being fun and funny with cool analogies and having the one eye that points at a wall, right? Like, so, but yeah, so my job entirely at Pax8 is to really serve external endeavors, both in the vendor, consumer, B2C space, as well as in the MSP space, in each different capacity, I guess. So
awesome. Cool. Good stuff. So on this podcast, we usually talk a lot about security strategies, typically geared towards like a specific organization, like as the end user, I guess, like here's how you keep your company secure. But many of our listeners, they are service providers and they do manage security for not just them, but their own organization, their customers' organizations.
Yeah, I love that distinction. Thank you, because that is true. There is two halves to that coin.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Okay,
and so today I wanted to pick your brain really on some of the factors that MSPs and MSSPs need to consider when it comes to defending and proving that they're doing the right thing, really. And so before we jump into that, so first off, big question, why do you think it's important for an MSP or a security service provider to consider defending defensibility in their own offerings?
Yeah. And I like that you made a distinction in defending and defensibility, right? Because those are two different aspects to this. But I'll also shoot a shot, right? I actually gave this speech at Tiga's kickoff, sales kickoff. No, I think it was a partner. I apologize. But there were a bunch of MSSPs in the room. And I actually fired the shot and said there is no such thing as an MSSP. And I'll state that in a pretty fair and sincere way, in the point that Congress stepped out and said what I've been saying for years, right? In CIRCIA, if you read the definitions in CIRCIA, which is the Critical Infrastructure Reporting Act, if you see in that, they only define the word MSP. If you are a managed service provider of any type, if you do security services, if you do manage data, I don't care, it's an MSP, and we're going to define it. And I think the reason for that is it's almost a farce to believe that you're going to provide holistic security as an MSSP if you don't understand the data, if you don't know the data sensitivity, if you don't know the data flows and the way that it works inside the organization, and the way, if you're not responsible for turning the wrench, you're going to have a hard time having the conversations about that service bridge. And I think the ones that do that well will do that well. But I think an MSP and MSSP, in my farce of this, really is kind of defined as, we all have this responsibility now. We all have to be able to report. We all have to have this, and that's where it goes into my definition of defensibility.
I could even flip that to, if you're an IT provider and you're providing technology, you can't not consider security.
Thank you for finishing it.
Yeah,
exactly right.
Sorry. I apologize. I
no, 100%. Yeah.
Trust me, Matt, you get used to it.
Well, he's brilliant, right? So he jumps to the same conclusions at the same point. The inverse of that is the point that this is a convergence in our field. We are seeing a point where you're having to make an inflection to be able to answer for how you're going to deal with the security, as well as answering for how you're going to deal with turning the wrench in the right and more secure way. Everybody talks about security like it's a tool. It's DNS protection, or it's this advanced inspection. Nope, not at all. Nor is surgery a surgery, right, without the scalpel. It's the surgeon. And I think the point is, we have so many things that are procedural, so many attack vectors that are human, so many things that just really come down to an MSP that's touching the wrench has the keys to get the wrench out, which means that we have to deal with our own security, how we detect, and everybody's so focused on protect. But if you look at every framework, it's identify what you have, protect it the best you can, and understand the threat vectors. But by God, detect, respond, and recover come into much more capability in what comes of that attack than the first two. Right. And so I
harp
see
on a bit too.
Yeah.
Like it's nuts. Everyone spends everything on trying to prevent the attack, and then they get caught with their pants down when someone slips through. Like, that employee brought into the thumb drive.
And it's inevitable. You're never going to block everything.
Whatever.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. So you bring me back to my analogy, right? So this is this analogy aspect. So let's say we're going to talk about American football, because I'm back in like mostly America land, but like I get hit for this when I'm global, and people are like, what about soccer or real football, Matt?
Anyways, Arsenal over here, by the way, he's probably
yeah, fair. And it's more easy to explain here. So I'm being lazy by using American football if you need to stand on that pulpit. But the point is, in American football, as a defensive player and as a defensive coach guiding those 11 players in their positions that they know how to respond to attacks from the other side, that coach, if he stood up the day before the game on an NFL game and said, I'm not going to allow a single yard, who says that's acceptable or even believable or even real? Right.
Yeah.
And so what I like to use as an analogy to help people understand this shift in thinking is that defensibility for that coach and not getting fired is if he knows that left guard's getting beat every time by Mark across the line from him, every time he's getting crushed, that I now have to bring my inside linebacker up to cover Mark's failure. I now have to bring my corner in closer. I have to bring my safety in from outside. I have to adjust to that in a way that I'm being defensible to overcome those losses and trying to find ways to stop it faster, to have Mark have coping mechanisms, or Corey, whoever I made my first example, kneel down instead of getting crushed, maybe take the loss a yard closer so the hole's smaller, right? You could do things and as that coach, you have to be able to say, here's what I did to adjust. I also got with Corey in the weight rooms, made sure he was really putting it on them lower legs, right? I also, like, you see those actions and they're very documented and they're provable and they're things that prove we know. And what they're trying to do in security is meet the rule of the land today, which is really just the reasonable person rule. The reasonable person rule simply states, would a reasonable person find your actions defensible? Would you have done the right thing? Well, if I simply say I bought an EDR product compared to I made a realization that my overall anti-malware capabilities according to 10.1 on the CIS framework weren't where they needed to be. I wasn't using a learning type algorithm in 10.3. I needed a centralized console in 10.4. So I moved to this product. Here's how we documented. This was our titration methodology. Here's how we retired the old. Here's where we're dealing with this on a contractual basis. And people said, no, here's where you start seeing a world where you're building a story, you're authoring history, right? And so, kind of when you get into that, that piece of this, that what I wanted to talk about today is just that concept of understanding you're not going to win. And if you're not going to win, the only way to win is to stop enough yards that they don't score the touchdown, to limit the blast radius, to be faster at detecting that change. And the best coaches in history are the ones that go in that locker room at halftime and come back a whole different team, right? Because they've adjusted to the strategies in front of them, which means you're aware of the strategy. You're not simply saying this panacea will protect me. Yeah. Right, this antivirus or this watch guard.
And by the way,
all great.
To meet all those CIS controls, ultimately that second person might have also added EDR to their thing, but it wasn't 100%. It wasn't for EDR. It was because they understood the issue and what the best mitigation was.
Yeah. Just like understanding that a guard's job is to not have this giant hole open up. That means the secondary has to respond, right? Like that's the core function. And then how do I do that is all the other. And so we're kind of watching an industry, even the MSSPs, like I proffered this in my keynote speech, was even the MSSPs that self-ascribed were usually tool managers. They were usually really not understanding the underlying infrastructure, data flows, restrictions, principles of least privilege. They were literally just saying, I will do your EDR better. And that's true. But let's call it what it is, right? This is an enablement capability as a service provider as security, but not really the end all security understanding. You have to have all halves firing, good processes and an MSP as part of that, right? So this is where that defensibility comes back into play. And we're seeing it everywhere, right? We're seeing it in Congress. We're seeing this come down from both CERCIA. Additionally, I don't know if you guys want to chat on this one today at some point, the SEC, postulation. I don't know if you've seen this new proposal in the Security and Exchange Commissions around.
Remind us, which one?
Publicly traded organizations. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Needing a cybersecurity person on the board from representation. But if you look, it follows the same pattern as Sarbanes-Oxley, right? After SOX, you had to have a financial person on the board. Why? Answer why. So that you could arrest someone when they had and should have known better. Swear to God, that's the Martha Stewart treatment, right? It puts the board to understand if we don't report this accurately and we don't report our risk accurately and the things that are on our quote unquote POAM or whatever this turns into being, then now we're actually misleading the public trust from an investment perspective, and the SEC has jurisdiction. Right. And so you start seeing a world where we could actually see boards having to listen to the people that are saying things that in those large organizations often get ignored for lack of anything other than business drive. There's just nothing driving it from a business perspective.
Yeah.
So
would you say, I mean, the target breach is so overstated, but I feel like that was one of the first times where at least C-level members started getting fired because of essentially negligence. Like if there's nothing driving it like that, again, the issue with security is it's not what drives revenue for the organization.
Not usually.
It was what saves revenue. I mean, and that's what happened. If people neglect it, they finally actually held you accountable. So definitely love the idea of board members doing it.
What's funny, you touched on something. Scott Augenbaum, FBI agent that does a lot of speaking in our world, actually has one of his slides on his live speeches where he points to the timeline. He said, I knew cybersecurity was solved in 2014. I knew it. Because target breach finally brought this into the public. And he said, and then he did this long hyperbolous slide where it's like all the other things that happened after that, right? Like, since 14. And he was doing it to be, joking. But yeah, I agree. Like we're all walking through this. And I make a lot of correlations to the industrial evolution because I think actually it's kind of relative in the sense that we had cars in like 1860 something. We didn't have seatbelts till Ralph Nader. Right, like we didn't have seatbelts till 1974 with unsafe at industry.
Exactly. I mean, I'm Pop Corey. I remember when we didn't have the internet, Mark. When I actually had to have a coupler modem.
Like that? There was a time where you had
to
we
are totally in the infancy of this for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's the point is that just like the Industrial Revolution, you'd build a house and it wasn't on 16-inch studs. And when it would snow, people would die. But geolocated, someone in the north might build that house better. That's always there. And they don't have that. So you start setting regulations and standards like NIST, CSF, and CIS V8, V7, .1, doesn't matter, not making delineations, but are all frameworks and guidances where we have to stop as the MSPs being the smartest guy and gal in the room. And start realizing that we need referential objects to hold ourselves to so that we can actually have real conversations about empirical posture, right? Like, here are the things I don't do well. Here are the things my client won't do. And here's what they say is the best practice, right? If you look at CIS, there's the 56 IG1 controls and then whatever the summative.
By the way, let's pause for a sec. I mean, you're throwing out a lot of acronyms that hopefully our audience knows. Like, CIS is Center for Internet Security, and they have the Critical Security Controls Framework. You mentioned, I think, NIST's Cybersecurity Framework. If we have Australian listeners, they've probably
Essential 8.
The Essential 8, exactly, which, I mean, ultimately, they all have similar best practices. Essential 8, patching, application hardening. I mean, we could all go through them. With all these frameworks, do you have like a preference? I mean, should people worry about which to use? Is the point more about adopting a framework? Because what you really need is a procedure to do the best practices. Or what are your thoughts?
I think you get into that opinion delineation, right? So I would start by saying, I don't care which one you use. I really don't care as long as you didn't make it up and you have some referential belief that this will empirically reduce risk, and you use that as a basis, and even if your assessments aren't the best, they're assessed against the same framework. So I would start by saying, I don't care what framework. They're all trying to solve the same problem. Now, if you're asking what I find to be the more pragmatic framework, I would find CIS. And the reason for that, I've spent a lot of time with Phyllis Lee. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, that
okay.
Sounds good.
I would say CIS, and it's really because in CIS, you have a very pragmatic sentence stated with not a lot of guidelines that might make it not relevant to you when it really still should matter in its core concept. They don't try to overdefine it, right? I actually asked Phyllis, I said, Phyllis, what's your intent for making these so wide? And I already had my belief as to why they were that way. But why do you make these so broad? Why do you just make a statement like saying, have a centralized management console for antivirus? Have an automated process for doing this. Have MFA. And she actually used MFA as the example to bring me to understand. She said, Matt, MFA, you would argue with most MSP professionals, most security professionals, that text-based sucks, that it's probably the least secure methodology. And she said, and some people would use that as a reason not to do it, even though it's the one they could implement.
Yeah.
And the argument is, I'd rather the framework be loose enough to be encompassing everyone in the general concept of it, and then use that to iterate upon itself. And I'm like, this so totally defends my defensibility argument, right? Be better every day. Know your weaknesses and what you could do, but put in what you can today, and don't let perfect be the enemy of good. All too often, we get lost in that perfection is the answer because we're trying to chase this really tough framework, when just simply having AV at least meets the need of having AV. And now you've made A barrier.
Yeah, there's a problem in the ivory tower. I think it comes down to, like, a lot of our, think about passwords. Like, the reason we're going passwordless is because we gave the logical right advice, right? I mean, all you have to do is use 20-character passwords. And by the way, they should be really random and have a lot of characters, and use a different one everywhere. Everyone knows that's what you should do.
Yeah.
Nobody can freaking do. I mean, maybe with password managers now, yes, but no one can do that. Yeah. So perfect was the enemy of the good. And me and Mark, I mean, we do point this out. We love MFA because we are security nerds. We sometimes crap on text-based as not being the ideal one, but we always say that if you can't do anything but text-based, you better as heck turn that text-based on. I would rather have a bad factor, second factor, than no factor.
Amen. And some 100%. Frameworks would be exclusive of that thought process, right?
You have to use exactly this level of encryption, or absolutely.
Start talking about FIPS compliances and things. Like, it's just, you're getting into
these ciphers are bad.
Yeah. And I think what I like about CIS is if you're the general non-regulated public, non-regulated, not incentivized to drive towards these things, whether it be market conditions or industry or size. But when you're in that space, CIS is such a good barometer of what's my risk capabilities around certain things, and where do I have gaps, and at least understanding and in some ways educating about those gaps. Okay, you won't let me take away local admin rights. I want you to understand that that means that anyone landing on this box can, just like even be that Matt Lee's low-level hacker level, right? And run a script and escalate privilege, and now start attacking Active Directory, attacking OAuth tokens, attacking these things that matter, and being able to show that. So I like to do a lot of live video demos where I just do live Evilgenix demos or live things to kind of like show those. They're so great, right?
They tell people react to those more than anything, because it's like you see 100%. The problem rather than hear it.
Yeah. And it's a picture's worth 1,000 words. When you can't maybe understand all the context, you sure as hell understand seeing your password right there in giant green letters, right? Like you totally get that. And if you're doing it right, you do something fun. You like pick a guy in the audience and go, Bob Coppage is a goober or something, right? And then you just like put that as the password. So you're typing it out. And anyways, but
that was always one of my favorite demos we did at trade shows like RSA or IP Expo or something, where, set up Wi-Fi, secure Wi-Fi at the booth, do a demo of
so good.
One of us logging in, like getting their LinkedIn password or something, or even just the whole, hey, look, we had 7,000 people connected go in flight in the middle of San Francisco's Moscone Center,
because the auto connections that are set there and you have nothing. And so 100%, right? Like,
was it Karma? What's the one? There's a Wi-Fi one where basically they'll watch the beaconing of the phone. You know how everyone connects to whatever network. You don't have to get them to,
you don't even have to know them. That's built in.
We just look for their beaconing and we get them to attach to our network.
That's built in right here.
Pineapple, exactly. In fact, all our SEs have that sucker.
They're so good. But and we got a little tangential, right? But having a framework helps demonstrate to someone why you would take away local admin rights. And even though it costs nothing, it's hearts and minds that are usually the problems in that. Because
by the way,
things,
oh, sorry.
Anyways, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I like the fact that you're mentioning how general framework allows you to do the right thing for your company. One of the things I like about Australia's Essential 8 is they have this maturity model thing too, where the Essential 8 are still the 8 core pieces of advice or controls, but then they have 3 levels of maturity, so that if you're like starting at security, here's what the Essential 8 means to you. It's not like that full what we would recommend of MFA
Here's
everywhere.
the SIM right away, which is going to parse something you don't even understand, and the time logs aren't even
You're not even big enough. You're a tiny company. But then maturity model 2 changes it up. So they can, the smart ones will also offer guidance because every organization isn't the same. And frankly, I think one thing I really liked is, honestly, the controls don't matter. Like, have you done a data audit? Have you done a risk assessment? Do you know what's big?
Do you even know what you're collecting? Are you an ice cream store collecting Matt's social and date of birth and his eye retina scan? Like, there might be a problem with that. You might consider
on the
data
flip side,
changes.
There may be 50% of your stuff that's not critical at all. And why spend money securing that? Like, that's acceptable risk. Let that go and spend your money where it matters.
You want to know how I handle that from an analogy perspective? This one's a fun one.
Oh, I love it. We're going to have to steal all your analogies.
Yeah, that's what they're there for. This is public license. Like, I'm the, the Unix open source GNU or whatever it is license. But so I don't know much about the licensing models, so I apologize. Like, that's a weak spot for me. So here's the point. So like, I like to tell people you can spend $1 million protecting $1, right? Like, so we have to be smart about how we go about protection. And the great example is this. If I come up to Mark and say, hey, Mark, I have a 1979 Cherry Cadillac. The windows don't roll up. It's black. It's beautiful. I'm going to park it out on the street, and I'm a little worried. Here's $150. Go out there and look after it tonight for me, right? Like, Mark might even not sit out there. Might even set up a baby camera, right, with some alert software or something, and be like, cool, I'll just keep an eye on it for you. Nothing's going to happen. What if I didn't tell Mark there was $10 billion in bearer bonds in the back seat, and I had rented airplanes to tell everybody the GPS coordinates for the last like 3 weeks of where that car is going to be parked, and the windows don't roll up, and they're sitting in the back seat signed? There's a much different protection algorithm. There's a much different methodology. We'd now set up ring fencing. We'd have things that say, no, you get in here, we're going to start questioning you. Here we have the police rented at this much an hour. Why? Because the value of the asset matters how you might protect it. And knowledge of that value of that asset, or its value to you, also matters. And so the point is, that's my analogy of how I bring people into understanding that we still have to be considerate of the business case. We can't just spend and protect perfectly unless we start getting into endemic systems. Now, you start looking at cloud native models, this might change quite a bit. If you were in a world that didn't have the technical debt of physical servers, infrastructural servers, infrastructure code, you're not creating code, you're not WatchGuard having to create these OSs and firmwares and all these things, right? But if you're just a consuming entity, if you were 100% cloud native and you were using Okta or Azure Active Directory as your identity, or an identity source, an IDP, you guys have one, right? If you were using that as your core, and then extending in all SaaS through SAML or through OIDC, right? OpenID Connect or Security Account Markup Language. Maybe I'm wrong, or SAML. If you were using, if you were using one of those two protocols, which, if anybody's listening doesn't understand that, it's where you just sign in with Microsoft. You know how you go into this thing and it says sign in with Facebook. That is a form of an identity provider connecting with another asset, and bringing that identity in. So you now don't have a password. Back to that whole potential of going passwordless. But if you lived in a world like that, I could script every customer identically. I could make the same settings in every tenant the same way. I could make the same exact outcomes. I'd know exactly how to guide them through the process of getting them on MFA. I'd know the process of how to onboard someone. I'd know how to extend those things as projects to fix that. Like, I'd have a very, very, very defensible, very monolithic protection methodology that would be a normalized cost at that space, right? Like, so I think that's where we're heading. I think the challenge is you have a lot of people with infrastructural anchors, right? They have the old line of business software. They're still running this EMR.
A lot of transition. Yeah.
And I like the experience.
Yeah, me too. Right. 100%. Inward pointing fingers there.
So pivoting real quick now, like, that was a great line of talk there. But I want to just pick your brain on another area too, where you work in this unique situation of working for a distributor, working with managed service providers. Like, I'm sure you get to see a whole lot of different things. And one of the issues we see is, with service providers working with their customers, there's a lot of different cybersecurity services that you can offer, should offer, and in most scenarios should be used across the board. Yeah. But like, you encounter organizations where maybe due to resourcing or budgeting or whatever, like, they'd end up having to pick and choose, and it's not necessarily, and it potentially like weakens their strategy really. Yeah. And so how could an MSP go about either like convincing or packaging services up in a way to encourage customers to deploy the right level, or like at least make sure they understand the risks of declining something, like,
Or
oh, I don't need
said another
MFA
way,
because whatever.
yeah, ultimately, some of the customers might, if they expect IT and security services from you, they might blame you when things go wrong. But
Not might, they do.
yeah, they do. Yeah, exactly. I was trying to be polite.
Yeah, fair.
They
Let's just be
will.
empirical
They'll
on
yell
this
at
one.
you.
Yeah.
But sometimes you don't get the full. Yeah, like depending. I mean, some MSPs may have a strategy that helps them deal with this. But what's your advice on how you make sure they adopt at least that base package that allows you to have a chance to do the right thing for them?
And I think that's the most beautiful statement, right? Just the question itself. Let's look at this. What's the base package? Where does that come from? Are you making that up? Well, you know, doctors went through the same problem. Okay. So doctors really only, and doctors might hate me for this and you get into the real history of it. I'm like the pseudo history, but doctors really in the late 1700s or whatever it might be, might have known how to saw off a leg and use leeches and potentially cauterize the wound in a way that I don't die of gangrene. Maybe. That was about it, right? Like being summative. But as you look at it, doctors had to grow and grow. And I got all this from a TED Talk. There's a fantastic TED Talk about checklists with doctors, okay? But as you go through it, doctors advanced and advanced, and they had now hundreds of things they could treat by the early 1900s. They had tons of different methodologies, but that was localized. It was maybe just spread throughout different. There wasn't a barrier to entry. You had to, what other field has grown in such a capacitance as barrier to entry?
I couldn't guess. I never would. Yeah,
it's going to be IT and cybersecurity, right? And so the point is, doctors solved this by at some point having standards, at some point having an educational barrier, an apprenticeship barrier, right? That's the reason they have residency. That's the reason they have. So you start seeing some of those things. So I do believe part of this is us, our problem. That being said, the same attribution in this TED Talk was that they took this hospital in rural Alabama and they said, hey, listen, I want every surgery to end with this checklist, a physical checklist. I know you're a smart surgeon. I know you went through all this stuff and you got all the things in your head and you never have to explain yourself because people don't understand the blood pressure vessel thing again. You start getting yourself into, okay, as that surgeon, then how do I make sure I'm doing what's generally accepted? And they found that by doing those checklists after, which was stuff like how many sponges did I come in with? How many did I leave with? It was stuff like, did I give a post-surgical dose of antibiotics and at the right amount of time? And did I check temperature? And did I, those things? And as they did that, they saw this massive reduction in fatalities after surgery, like 40%.
Yep.
And the number was just so empirically valid that they said, hey, maybe the problem is that we've let these people be the smartest people in the room, and they've not had to prove that accountability to the actual basics and functions. And I think that's what we surface ourselves. And I think if you look at frameworks, I don't care which one. I haven't found a bad framework. I've found ones that are hard to use, looking at you 800-171 or CMMC's applicability, but I've not met a bad framework. And so if you take that and you use that as your post-surgical checklist, and you simply say, okay, here's my package. My package is what I used to sell 3 years ago. And now I've sold this one since then, and that one since then, and this one since then. You're still in that one. You won't go to this one. I can't get you. You now just simply have this chart to show them, here's what this used to be able to do, and here's the limitations. Here's the things I can do, and please sign off on it. The other thing I'll say to that point, not great at nonlinear thinking, but the other thing I'll say to that point is that if you take that same experience and just tell them I'm turning this on, my history has been that they take it, right? You've heard of my history around email protection. I sent out this email to all of our customers. At this time, I think it was like maybe 100 customers. And, it was about a $3 million revenue practice. And we said, hey, listen, we're going to turn on email protection. It's $3 an endpoint. We're going to back up your email to a third-party service because Microsoft says they don't do it. Please let us know if you want to opt out. Otherwise, we're turning it on. How many people out of 100 do you think opted out?
No, not many.
3.
That's pretty good.
One of them, we talked back into it, right?
Yeah.
And the point was, I think oftentimes we're afraid to be prescriptive. We're afraid to step out and say, this is what you got to do.
But I agree, that's a mistake. That's why they come to you. I mean, like you say, it's about trust. We need to get to a point where they do trust
and
that we are the experts.
But
it shouldn't be where the MSP is asking, well, what product do you want to fix this, or what? It should be, here's my packages. Okay, you tell me what you want. You want me to handle, file services, endpoints.
Yep.
I have a security package. I have a basic, a medium, and a high.
But I need to do my job.
Level. But I'm going to prescribe the security. You just pick the level of package you want depending on your organization needs. So I love the prescription method. I like MSPs that do that.
And it's worked for me a few times, right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, it's totally off topic, but I love your checklist thing. Me and Mark, or at least I always use the NASA checklist. You know,
Sure.
they have those little freaking, like, you're an astronaut, you're tied to this big, huge rocket, and suddenly the left engine goes out, and you expect an astronaut, is he going to remember every freaking switch and dial to turn? No,
Right.
they flip to a book. This happened, dude. This, and
they have
this.
enough knowledge and context to understand what they're doing and why it relates. It's not like we're saying they're stupid.
They're smart as heck. They trained, but
they won't miss that one stupid thing.
They need that little thing on their arm that has a procedure for every problem that they might have. And that's why NASA's been so successful at keeping people alive in the 100%. Worst places in the universe.
Without a lot of knowledge of all the variables that might exist beyond what you can measure. I mean, you start getting into that, and it's kind of similar to our world. And I think that's the point, is that if you still are only held as an MSP to the, reasonable person rule, but there hasn't been a lot of case precedents. There hasn't been a lot of things that are out there besides that. There's some pushes by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is saying, hey, we're at least going to sue you for not doing what you said in your contract, right? We're talking about suing you if you aren't patching when you say you're patching. Like, that kind of stuff's there. But when you really get into it, other than that, your security strategy, there's more guidance from FINRA as to how you lose being a Series 7 stockbroker because you didn't follow the right and known strategies than there is for us. There's no way to lose my license. Right? There's no license.
What license?
Not yet.
Right. I think that's kind of part of this problem too, is that you don't have, like, it's back to what you said earlier, right? This is the infancy. We really are at the beginning of this becoming something endemic in the public. Congress is talking about it. The SEC is talking about it.
7 years ago, our family members didn't know about it. Now it's on the nightly news. So it's definitely happening.
It's often misattributed, though, because, like, I was at this cybersecurity conference in Virginia, and the reporter came and interviewed me, and it was awesome. But all she wanted to talk about was the correlation to Russia. That was it. That's all she wanted to talk about. And so it's like, even that has this kind of, like, we tell the news as we want to see it and talk about it. Like, I don't want to get into a tangent, but we are at least entering the news. We are at least becoming, man, you can't get gas in North Carolina this week. Why? Something happened to this pipeline or something. Like,
Honestly, that is progress, though. Like, anything that just gets overall, visibility into this as an issue is something that it's one step. And we got
I get a job, right? It's at this early phase where anybody can do it. I mean, any idiot can get up and talk about it. So
tell me about it. That's why I started 20 years ago.
Right? Yeah. It's even
didn't even know much.
So much.
No.
Oh, shit!
Taking the hard route.
So I know a lot.
I want to end, and honestly, you hit on a lot of this, and you mentioned during your origin story with, like, a bit of adversity to kind of start that really caused you to pick up that sword. And you've mentioned this reasonable person rule and, like, do care along the way, but really, like, what do you think what can you do to make sure you live up to these standards as they're kind of being defined? And it is pretty nebulous. It feels like there's potential regulations coming all over the place, but it will still probably boil down to just doing the right thing and doing what's bare minimum required for security. So what's some, like, guidance you can give around that?
The best guidance is a crappy policy beats a perfect one. And what I mean by that is, if you can live that crappy policy and prove you're doing it and know your own self and know your limitations and know your restrictions, then that is a defensible start. And as you continue this, and you spoke towards it, there's going to be more and more regulations. Don't stop there. You got to grow. You got to put it on paper. If you take one example, like let's look at the Control 1 in CIS, where it's talking about knowing your assets or knowing yourself, Control 1 and 2, right? Data and physical assets. And so as you start looking at that, what if initially it's just an Excel spreadsheet and you're just writing down every time you buy a new one? Well, that's not very automated. It has a lot of human failure. It has a lot of change control problems. There's a lot of things that don't work, but write that down as my policy. And then as I am going to work on that, I write in my POAM, right? And this goes back to having a plan of action and milestones. So something to do because I know it's a problem, and some way to measure its success, right? So POAM. But if you have a POAM and you say, I am procedure, or my asset discovery procedure is simple and it doesn't work the way I want to. I know I need to improve this, and then document that journey. Like, auditors love to read the journey of a policy. They love to read the constant improvement. Why? Because they're trying to determine, is this real or is this a checkbox? And as you see the requirements come, more of those requirements are going to shift from I swear to God, I'm not talking about you, CMMC, but more of those policies are going to shift from self-attestation, oh, I'm doing fine, to some degree of a capitalistic endeavor to have someone say, yes, you are, or no, you're not doing fine. And as you start seeing that, showing that journey and being honest with yourself about where you are and always striving to be better meets the reasonable person rule today, but it also meets this just humble transparency you have to have with yourself about how bad it really is. Humble transparency with you to understand there's so many gaps of what you didn't understand now that you compare yourself to a framework, and the ability to take that humility, share it, to be genuine to your customer base and explain to them when they ask the question of, I thought you were handling this. Well, let me lay out what this is, and we'll have a conversation. And you'll get that conversation. And as you do that, you'll have more revenue for the ones that get it. You'll hopefully ultimately fire the ones that don't, that you can't do well enough for to educate them through, or they're not educatable, and drive that forward so that you can show healthy practices going towards a needle. If you can do that and be profitable and also deliver a better end user experience, a more secure world with less failures and losses, then you'll have the ability to continue what's necessary. I think the first iterations, like look at CIRCIA, which is the Critical Infrastructure Reporting Act that got bundled into the omnibus bill back in March. CIRCIA says you're going to have to report cyber incidents within 72 hours, right? You're going to have to be able to say, I know about this. Guess how long they have to even implement it? 18 to 24 months. Okay. My point is nothing's going to happen fast. So just stay attention, find a news source that you like, whether it's, this podcast that you're hearing right now, whether it's following me on my channels and my live things, but stay abreast of it. Don't be stupid. Willful ignorance and ignorance aren't defensible. So, but just be willing to take yourself and go through it. And I always hate seeing somebody lament at how bad they have it or how bad they are when they start looking at it, because that's where you start. Do you think that left guard? Yeah. Do you think that left guard that's getting beaten is being done any favors by telling them, man, you're crushing it, bro? No. It's much better to say, listen, you're getting crushed by about 3/4 of the people that put up against you. They're able to shift resources elsewhere because of this. You either need to get better. I'd love to help you. I want to help your teammates help you. Yeah. That's it. And so you start understanding that it's very genuine and it should attract people to buy your services, right? Like
it kind of it ties to your security as a human problem too. I mean, I geek out about technology, both
love the tech,
hack technology and good. I mean, there's nothing cool than a new 0 day. Yeah, but at the end of the day, I think people look at each other and if they see someone trying hard and failing, I mean, they made a movie about it, Rudy, right?
Yeah.
Trying hard.
You don't clap for Rudy, you're a horrible human. Yeah. Right? Like at the end of the day, like just real.
But they were trying. They tried, they exercised, they did work, they got slowly better. Maybe they weren't the best in the world, but it's the people you don't like are the ones that like say, yeah, I got
gloss
this.
It over.
And then
man,
they go smoke and ignore it. Yeah, or whatever it is.
And so those fingers point back to me as a vendor. Those fingers point back to you as a vendor. The same concept comes into start being transparent and humble. Start understanding your gaps, and let's all understand that we're all in the beginning phases in this virgin phase of technology, really. Even though it's been 60 years, we didn't have the internet until what, 90X, right?
Yeah, and so the first,
yeah. So you start looking at this, understanding that it's ours to go and fix this. We are where we are. Let's stop lying about it. Let's stop saying AI or the next machine learning or the next day. No, what's going to solve this is people finding giant problems that they're the bulk of loss, and then finding the pragmatic solutions to the bulk of loss. That comes from vendor. That comes from turning on MFA, taking away admin rights. All the stuff we just talked about is what's defined in most frameworks as the bulk of loss. Yeah. The protection mechanisms for the bulk of loss. So start where you are and grow is my short answer, Mark, if I had to put this in Jeopardy words. But
man, could have just had a 30-second podcast, not a 40-minute one.
I know. I'm not known for this.
I agree entirely. Like it's something is better than nothing as long as you're continually improving it too. And like, I totally get it. It's difficult sometimes when you just stare at the horror show that it can be sometimes in security and not even know where to start. And so I think you've given a lot of really good guidance on, pick a framework and just stick with it and iterate on it and improve on it. Yeah.
Yeah. 100%. And it tells a cool story, like drawing your kid's height on the wall. It feels wonderful at the end, right? You see a really tall kid.
Exactly. That's great. So thank you, Matt. You've been a massive wealth of knowledge. If people want to hear more from you, where's some spots that
what are some of those podcasts and places you mentioned before?
Exactly.
Yeah, gosh, let's start with just doing. At some point I realized, and this sounds self-aggrandizing, I'd be better just to have a web page and then do it that way than trying to remember where I am. So I have cybermattlee.com is my personal web page. I have my YouTube links there, my LinkedIn links there. Really active in LinkedIn. I share a lot of knowledge around CISA releases and around things that I think MSPs need to hear today, as well as small to mid-sized business.
I now get notifications on your streams there. Yeah,
exactly. And then YouTube, I do mainly for that longer reach education. And I hope you use those videos to educate your clients. That's what I make them for. But if you follow along Cyber Matt Lee, you can get you hooked up to all the different places from there. So
awesome, man. Pleasure.
Thank you so much for hopping on. We really
Pleasure's mine, gents. You guys do good work here. It's amazing.
So. Looking forward to getting to meet up with you sometime at one of these conferences.
Black Hat DEFCON, maybe?
Hey, you know what? I might be allowed back in this year. I've not been disallowed, so it's fantastic.
Great.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. It's been great.
Chat again soon.
See ya.
Thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you have any questions on today's topics or suggestions for future episode topics, you can reach out to us on Twitter. I'm at XORRO_. Corey is at SecAdept, and the both of us are at #the443podcast. And if you want to hear more from Matt, you can check him out again at cybermattlee.com. Thanks again for listening, and you will see us next week. Maybe.